For almost 50 years, if you turned on a television and found a comedy, there was a very good chance you were looking at the same basic setup: a living room, or an apartment, or an office, built like a small theater stage with one wall missing. A handful of actors performing in front of that missing wall, in front of a crowd of real people sitting in bleachers, laughing along in real time. It was called multi-camera because several cameras filmed the same performance simultaneously from different angles. And for decades, it wasn't just common. It was practically the definition of what a sitcom even was. Then, within the span of about 15 years, it seemed to vanish. Prestige comedy stopped touching it entirely. Award shows quietly stopped nominating it. An entire generation of viewers grew up assuming that real television comedy simply didn't look that way anymore. Flat lighting, live audience laughter, and all. Ask someone under 30 to name a multi-camera sitcom, and there's a real chance they'll struggle. Except, here's the twist almost nobody talks about. It didn't actually disappear. It's still being made, right now, on major networks, sometimes drawing more live viewers than half the buzzy streaming dramas everyone's talking about online. So what actually happened here? Did multi-camera sitcoms die? Or did something stranger happen, where an entire format got quietly written out of the cultural conversation while it was still standing right there the whole time? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly which forces killed the multi-camera sitcom's reputation, even while its ratings, in certain corners of the industry, refused to die at all. To understand the fall, you first have to understand exactly how dominant this format used to be, and why. Multi-camera sitcoms trace back to the early 1950s, when Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz pioneered the technique on I Love Lucy specifically to solve a practical problem. How do you capture a live, one-take performance in front of a real audience without losing the flexibility of multiple camera angles? The solution, several cameras running at once, all pointed at the same continuous performance, became the template for essentially the entire genre. Cheers, Taxi, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, All in the Family, Full House, Seinfeld, Friends, Everybody Loves Raymond. For half a century, this wasn't a stylistic niche. It was simply what mainstream American comedy looked like, week after week, on every major broadcast network. And there was a very good reason networks loved it beyond nostalgia or tradition. Multi-camera sitcoms are, by television production standards, remarkably fast and efficient to produce. A single episode can often be filmed in front of its studio audience in one night. Since the whole point of the format is capturing a continuous live performance, rather than painstakingly lighting and reshooting individual angles across multiple days, the way a single camera show does, that efficiency translates directly into lower costs and faster turnaround, which matters enormously when a network needs to fill 22 or more episodes of a season on a predictable schedule, year after year. So if the format was cheaper, faster, and had been reliably generating hits for 50 years, what actually started chipping away at it? It's worth sitting with just how large that cost gap actually was, because it explains why networks clung to the format for so long, even as critics turned against it. A multi-camera episode typically wraps in roughly a week, most of it rehearsal, with the actual filming compressed into a single night in front of the audience. A single camera episode, shot like a miniature film with its own lighting setup for every individual shot, can take significantly longer to produce the same 22 minutes of finished footage and requires a correspondingly larger crew and budget to pull off. For a broadcast network that needs to fill an entire primetime schedule with new episodes every single week for months at a stretch, that difference in cost and speed isn't a minor accounting detail. It's the difference between a program model that's financially sustainable at scale and one that isn't, which is exactly why multi-camera comedies survived far longer on traditional broadcast networks than anywhere else in the industry. The first crack came from critics and award shows, and it happened earlier than most people realize. As early as the late 1980s and 1990s, single-camera comedies like The Wonder Years began pulling serious awards attention away from the traditional multi-camera format, even while multi-camera shows still dominated in actual viewership. But the real turning point came in the 2000s. The last multi-camera sitcom to win the Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series was the final season of Everybody Loves Raymond, back in 2005. After that, the format essentially vanished from the category entirely for the better part of a decade. The Big Bang Theory, one of the most watched comedies in the history of television, managed a single comedy series nomination in 2014. and never won. For years afterward, multi-camera shows barely appeared in the category at all, to the point where the Television Academy eventually had to institute a specific rule guaranteeing at least one multi-camera series would be nominated for directing just to ensure the format wasn't completely locked out of recognition. Think about what that actually means. An entire format that was still drawing tens of millions of live viewers a week was simultaneously being treated by the industry's own awards infrastructure as if it barely existed. That gap between raw popularity and cultural prestige is exactly where the perception of multi-camera's death actually took root. Not in the ratings, but in the story critics and industry insiders were telling about what counted as good television. The second major blow came from a shift in where comedy was actually being produced. As streaming platforms rose to prominence, they largely avoided the multi-camera format almost entirely. Shows built for platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon leaned overwhelmingly toward the single-camera, cinematic style that had already begun dominating awards conversations, in part because these platforms were explicitly chasing the same critical prestige that had abandoned multi-camera years earlier. When a streaming platform did attempt a multi-camera revival, the results were often shaky. Netflix's That 90s Show, an attempt to revive the multi-camera format for a new streaming generation, struggled to recapture the chemistry and cultural relevance of its predecessor and was canceled after 2 seasons, a stumble that reinforced a growing industry assumption that streaming audiences simply weren't interested in the format anymore, regardless of whether that assumption was actually true. There's also a subtler, more structural reason streaming pulled away from multi-camera so completely. Streaming platforms operate globally, releasing shows simultaneously to audiences in dozens of countries with wildly different comedic sensibilities and cultural context. A live studio audience's laughter is an extremely American, extremely specific comedic signal, timed to jokes built around American cultural references and rhythms. A quieter, more visually driven single-camera comedy tends to translate across borders and dubbing far more smoothly than a room full of people audibly cracking up at a joke that might not land the same way once it's subtitled into another language. That's not the only reason streaming avoided the format, but it's a real, practical pressure that pushed platforms further toward the single-camera model almost by default. Meanwhile, an entire generation of comedy writers and directors, the ones who'd grown up admiring The Office and Arrested Development, rather than Cheers and Taxi, simply gravitated toward the tools that had shaped their own comedic instincts. Writing for a live studio audience requires a very specific theatrical skill set. Broad, presentational jokes built to land cleanly the very first time they're performed, with pacing calibrated for a room of people laughing in real time. That's a genuinely different muscle than writing quieter, more naturalistic single-camera comedy. And as fewer young writers came up through multi-camera writers' rooms, fewer people in the industry retained the specific expertise required to do it well. Skills that aren't practiced tend to atrophy, and that included this one. So by the mid-2010s, the narrative had calcified almost completely. Multi-camera sitcoms were old-fashioned, critically irrelevant, a relic that networks kept around out of stubbornness or nostalgia, rather than genuine creative merit. A handful of shows complicate that narrative even during its supposed dark ages, though. Norman Lear, the legendary creator behind All in the Family decades earlier, returned late in his career to help produce The Carmichael Show and a reimagined version of One Day at a Time, both traditional multi-camera sitcoms that tackled genuinely difficult, timely subject matter, immigration, addiction, identity, grief, in front of a live studio audience, and both earned real critical acclaim for proving the format could still handle weight and nuance when the writing was strong enough. It wasn't that critics were incapable of respecting multi-camera comedy. It was that so few shows in the format were still being built with that level of ambition, which made the exceptions stand out as exactly that. Exceptions. Actors who came up through the format have often described something about it that a purely visual comparison misses entirely. John Larroquette, who spent years starring in the classic multi-camera sitcom Night Court and later returned for its modern revival, has pointed out that there's a specific intimacy to performing in front of a live audience with several cameras rolling at once, something closer to doing a small play than shooting a film, where everyone in the room, cast and audience alike, understands they're watching something happen once, together, in real time. That's not a sensation single-camera comedy, however cinematically gorgeous. is built to replicate, and it's part of why performers who've worked in both formats often speak about multi-camera with a kind of genuine affection that outside critics rarely credit it with. And yet, here's the part of the story that complicates the entire disappeared narrative even further. It never actually left CBS's schedule. Producer Chuck Lorre, the creative force behind 2.5 Men, The Big Bang Theory, Mom, and young Sheldon's spin-off Georgie and Mandy's First Marriage, has spent decades essentially keeping the multi-camera format alive almost single-handedly on network television, insisting publicly that some of the greatest shows in television history were filmed in front of a live audience, and asking pointedly why that would suddenly stop being true. When critics and journalists have repeatedly declared the format dead over the years, sometimes literally using that word, Lorre and his collaborators have pointed to the simple, stubborn fact that audiences kept showing up anyway. The Big Bang Theory ran for 12 seasons and became one of the most watched comedies of its entire era. Multi-camera format, laugh track, and all, airing at the exact moment critics were writing its obituary. And the story doesn't stop with Lorre. As recently as the mid-2020s, traditional multi-camera sitcoms on NBC and CBS have continued pulling in large, dependable audiences right out of the gate, even in years when streaming dramas dominated the cultural conversation and swept the major award shows. NBC's Happy's Place and Street, Denny's Medical both debuted as traditional broadcast comedies and pulled in large audiences from their very first episodes, holding onto those numbers across their debut seasons, at a moment when critics were busy pointing to prestige streaming dramas as proof that network comedy's era was permanently over. It turns out a meaningful chunk of the television audience, particularly viewers looking for something to have on in the background, something reliably light after a long day, never actually stopped wanting exactly what multi-camera sitcoms have always offered: a broad, warm, low-stakes half-hour with a live audience's laughter reassuring you that it's okay to relax. There's something genuinely revealing in that gap between perception and reality. Multi-camera sitcoms didn't die so much as they got quietly reclassified, treated by critics, awards bodies, and prestige-chasing streaming platforms as a lower tier of television, even while a significant portion of the actual audience never stopped watching. The format's death was, in a very real sense, a story the industry's cultural gatekeepers told about the format, more than it was a story about what audiences were actually choosing to watch on a Thursday night. That doesn't mean the criticism was entirely unfair either. Plenty of multi-camera sitcoms in the 2000s and 2010s genuinely did lean on flat lighting, predictable jokes, and a familiar laugh track to paper over weaker writing, giving critics real ammunition for the argument that the format had grown creatively stale. But the format itself was never really the problem. A well-written multi-camera show with a strong ensemble and sharp enough jokes still works exactly the way it worked 70 years ago, for the simple reason that watching real people make a room full of other real people laugh in real time still produces something a beautifully lit, quietly filmed single-camera drama comedy was never actually built to replicate. So the next time someone tells you multi-camera sitcoms are dead, or that nobody makes them anymore, you'll know the more accurate version of that story. The format didn't disappear. It got pushed out of the awards ceremonies, abandoned by the platforms chasing global prestige, and largely written out of the conversation among critics and younger audiences who grew up on a different visual language entirely. But on at least one American broadcast network, in front of at least one live studio audience, week after week, somebody is still building that same small stage with one wall missing